show. Spring is officially here, and even though it looks a little dreary right now, I believe the sun will come out. It's going to be a marvelous day to get outside, but you don't want to go quite yet because we have a wonderful show, and I am excited to be your host, Diane Gatsis Havinga. So once a month, we've started to put together what we call Throwback Thursday, and this is Throwback Thursday today, Thursday, March 19th, 2020. And since we entered a new decade back in January, do you remember January when everything was still kind of the same? Anyway, we decided that each month we would chronologically pick a show from that decade. So we're up to 2013 right now, and we have a doozy, and it's really quite timely because the person this show spotlights unfortunately passed away yesterday. So we're also marking her passing by showing you and sharing you a Telly award-winning show back from June 7, 2017. This was a program that our former staff member Andrew Seegers produced and directed and edited. It's called Ragtime Piano, and it features Bettie Jean Owen. So let's take a look.
My husband had to travel quite a bit. Thomas is out in Kansas, I think. It's the Midwestern state. When he came home, he had a piece of music in his hand, and he said, "You won't ever believe the pianist I heard." We always had it in my house because my mother was a very fine pianist. Yeah. And she was also an organist. She was still playing the organ when she was 87 years old for a church. But she was what I call a natural pianist. She had grown up. She hadn't grown up. She was a small child in a very tiny Mississippi village. Her father would walk her down to the schoolhouse, which was in the church, and let her play the organ. And at that time, it was the old pump organ. But because in school, as I understand it in those days, they taught something known as, it's note singing. In other words, you don't have a melody, you sing the notes. And Mother could already play the piano by the time she was, in the 6th grade, and the organ. And so her father and mother sold everything they had and moved to a little town in Mississippi called Blue Mountain so that she could get a high school and a college education. And her father wanted her to major in piano. Well, in those days, you started with the scales. A lot of people don't realize, but that's where you start today, too, also, with the scales. Right. Yeah. And she did not continue taking lessons. She changed her major in college over to fine arts. And she was very, very good at speaking, teaching her children how to stand up, give a speech, speak distinctly. But I grew up with her playing the piano, particularly on Sunday afternoons. Not much to do in the Mississippi Delta on a Sunday afternoon. And so she played swing. And we had a neighbor who also was a crackerjack pianist. So she would come over because she didn't have a piano, and she and Mother would alternate, particularly on Sunday afternoons. Then my older sister was already into studying the piano. And I guess my mother was the influence. We should be musical. My father loved classical music, but at the same time, he didn't play an instrument. But I gave a concert back in my home surroundings when I was in my 20s, and I always laughed. My father was a cotton farmer, and his favorite piece on my program was a Beethoven etude, I guess it was. No, it was a sonata.
So you started in the classical
Oh, yeah.
realm, okay.
Yeah. But my teacher, when I was about in the 7th grade, started this indoctrination in hymns, which was wonderful. And I realized after I matured that Leska, because she was the church pianist, she wanted me to take her place on Sundays and give her a little respite. So I learned hymns, and I've discovered that hymns set quite well for a number of reasons. It teaches you to transpose, because if you don't like one key, you can always put it in another, which might run you into some trouble. I had a violinist I was accompanying once, and I did that from E to E flat, because flats are so much easier to play. And she didn't miss a note. She went right into that E flat mode. But I played hymns, I accompanied the high school glee club, gave recital about once a year. My gang, if you call it a gang in high school, we always congregated at one particular house, and in the summertime, the lady would push her grand piano out on a enclosed porch, and there'd be 2 or 3. Well, poor Betty Jane, she was always stuck at the piano. And this lady's older son, who was much older than we were, loved Dixieland, and he had probably the first record player I ever saw in my life, except for the old-fashioned ones. It would change the stack of records by itself. And he was a drummer, so he liked ragtime. I mean, he liked Dixieland. So I heard all the Dixieland in that respect. And then I went to swing, like I said, playing for the gang. And then by the time I got to college, I still liked Dixieland. Of course, I had to delve in classical music more so.
Right.
And then I met the man I was going to marry after I got out of college.
Right.
And at that time I was teaching English. I got on a Greyhound bus every Saturday, went to Memphis, Tennessee, rode an hour, 30 minutes out to a school of music, and studied with a teacher that I had already heard his pupils. And I knew that I wanted to study with him. So I picked this little bitty town in Mississippi to teach English. And that was my Saturday for 2 years. Still, no ragtime. And while I was in Memphis then, teaching and studying with Mr. Myers, I had known my future husband at one time, but not really. He was from another little town.
Yeah.
And so we managed to meet at a bus station one day.
Yeah.
He was going back to the University of Mississippi. I was heading north for Sardis, Mississippi. And I said, "Oh, how are you? Aren't you Doc Owen?" I'd been dating his best friend all summer. So that's how I had met him. And he said, "You're one of the Boland girls, aren't you? What are you doing on this bus?" I thought, he doesn't even remember my name. I had 3 sisters.
Yeah.
And he said, "I'll call you next week." So he did. Well, that was the beginning of a 6-year romance. So Thomas and I were married in '54, and of all things moved to Erie, Pennsylvania.
Totally new environment for you.
Totally.
Yeah.
One of the best things that could have ever happened to me.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I went from an agricultural society, which ruled that section of the Delta,
Yeah.
to a completely industrial one where the culture was completely different.
Probably politically different, too.
politically,
Yeah.
church-wise, education-wise. And they had a very good philharmonic. And Thomas had to travel, like I say. He was rarely home during the week, all over the United States. Well, he was probably 55 by this time, right? So I got interested in philharmonic work and also in a poetry group. So I got to know that strata of people in Erie. And then we joined a very small church, which I really enjoyed. It was more like the churches that I had grown up in. And so Thomas is out in Kansas, I think. It's the Midwestern state. When he came home, he had a piece of music in his hand, and he said, "You won't ever believe the pianist I heard." He had gone into a bar one night, and there sat Ragtime Bob Darsh, playing nothing but ragtime. Old-fashioned ragtime. What do you do with a rag?
You clean with it.
You throw it away.
Oh.
Well, ragtime, and remember its source, it began in the Midwest, Kansas and Missouri. It was highly influenced by the blues and Dixieland, which came up the Mississippi River and Chicago. Tin Pan Alley had not come into the ascendancy yet. And there's another reason for ragtime being mainly where it was formed originally. They had very fine black college in Joplin, Missouri. Also, there was, I don't know why, the Midwest, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, they provided schooling for the African Americans. This is not, 1900 is not very long after the Civil War ended. And you had minstrels, which adopted ragtime. You had traveling bands of very young black musicians. And when I say young, 16, 17, 18. You also have to remember where they played, mainly in speakeasies, brothels, dance halls. So it was considered unsavory. And that summer, which would be then the summer of '57, I was down in Mississippi with my parents, and they were going actually furniture shopping. And while they furniture shopped, there was a trash store very close. Well, by this time, Thomas and I had really gotten into the ragtime collection of if you could find music, which you couldn't find. There was no sheet music published. And I ran across the Maple Leaf Rag. Scott Joplin bought it, took it home. Thomas and I started working on that. And I mean, you work when you play the Maple Leaf Rag.
Oh, I bet.
I don't play it much, but if I really work at it, I can play it. This is like an evolution in a way. Thomas and I had, with our friends, when Thomas grabbed hold of something, it literally ruled his life except for his business. And so we had bought an old upright piano for $20, I think. We were, of course, in Erie, every house had a basement. So he and a buddy put that upright grand into our basement. Well, then when the children came along, we had a dog named Ragtime. He was in the basement. we had the swing set in the basement, because in Erie, from October to April, it snows. So your children can't go out. So we put the swing set down there. We had the choo-choo train running around the track, Thomas on the piano. And he had followed Bob Darsh. Wherever Bob Darsh played I guess you call them gigs.
He was there.
He was there. And he kept, raving about him. And so the sterilizer company had a subsidiary in Toronto, Canada. So Bob always played Toronto twice a year. So I don't ever know exactly how Thomas arranged his trips, but I got on a bus in Erie one day with my trusty book in my hand. They all played ragtime, and met Thomas in Toronto. And when he got in from the laboratory that night, we went out to hear Bob. The line reached around the entire block outside. That's how popular he was wherever he played. And I thought I could hear him, and I thought I would die if I did not get to hear him in person. It was an odd feeling. So somehow, I'm sure Thomas hopped around to the back door and gave somebody a 20, and I got to hear Bob. And I didn't go to sleep that night. It was that good, because it is perfect piano.
Yeah.
And my favorite instrument, my favorite mode of therapy, if you want to call it therapy, is the piano. I don't get to hear many great pianists anymore, but I have heard the greats on the piano. And I have heard people in little bands, all types of swing. I went through the boogie-woogie craze in the 40s and learned boogie-woogie, which is great. But when I heard ragtime, it was piano at its purest. So Bob introduced us to a couple of Torontoans who had formed a ragtime society. And once we went out to the guy's house, he had a den that was nothing but 1900. Ragtime piano music papered the walls, the piano, the bar, the spittoon. It just looked like that era. And they also published a newsletter. So every month we'd get a newsletter, what was going on, some of the pianists that were coming in, and by this time we had gotten a pretty fair collection of the old music. I brought one piece.
Yeah.
I had 3 boxes like the old music. And Thomas and I worked out a program for a friend of mine. She was responsible, and so we did a ragtime hour program. He did most of the talking because Erie couldn't understand my accent. Who can, And we just really got involved. And went to Toronto about once a year. Bob always asked us to play. We actually was in Montreal once, I can't remember what year that was, but before we left Erie. And we went right up to Montreal. And I'm sorry to say by this time, as with most pianists, he had started drinking alcohol. And so he couldn't finish the set. So Thomas and I just went and finished the set for him. He was here when we moved here in '65, and we went down to see him in the district. He came out to the house one Sunday afternoon, and my 2 daughters by this time, they, as my younger daughter would say, and I think I told you this, from the time she was about 2 or 4, she didn't go into another person's house, you know, and play with the children. But by that time, my older daughter was 2 years older, and they would just go down the street to a neighbor's.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget what she said in later years. Mother, I thought every house had an upright piano, a dog named Ragtime, a swing set in the basement. And to her, that was an eye-opening experience. Ragtime, I never thought of it as anything but our hobby.
Yeah.
When we would go home to Mississippi, a lot of times we'd be asked to play, and the people that we loved, they really enjoyed it, but really nobody got into it. And when we moved here, the church we belonged to had a very young minister, and he loved music. He had gone into it from singing, the voice aspect, but he just loved music. And actually one night I played the Maple Leaf Rag, let people discover I could play the piano. And so he asked us if we'd do a Sunday night program, like we used to have family night suppers.
Right.
And so Thomas and I would do that. And then I did programs, 20-minute programs for clubs and people's friends, you know, who had to get a program up.
Yep.
So and then it was just Thomas and me. We just loved to, you know, we'd have a whole night when we did nothing but play the piano.
Oh, that sounds great.
It was.
Yeah, I bet.
And every once in a while I'll play a tape of one of those nights, and it's, you know, it's just great. We just play the piano and have fun. And so the girls grew up with that atmosphere.
Yeah.
And we had 3 pianos in the house, and sometimes all 3 of them were playing at once with high school kids practicing voice. By this time, I had a little Boston Terrier named Pushkin, and when the girls would hit one note singing,
Yeah.
I could see Pushkin. He would get up in the den, and he'd run up the steps, and he'd finally get to the piano and sit down and just howl like, how bad she hurt his ears.
Yeah, I bet.
Playing the talent show was the first time I had this wide exposure in Green Springs.
Right.
I actually had already done a short program for the dramatic club, and also the DAR. So people knew I played piano, but, and then out of the blue, I was asked to do the talent show. So I did it. I cannot remember our director's name at that time, our entertainment director.
Michael.
I liked him so much.
Yeah.
And I will never forget, we had to have a rehearsal. And I went over to tried out the piano and all that, told him it was Ragtime. And then I played, and that night. And it was very fortunate because I had just done 2 hour-and-a-half programs for Lifetime Learning on the history of Ragtime and performed all of the music. So I started working on that in January one year, and those 2 Lifetime Learning programs were in, I believe, March. So when Michael called me and asked me to be on the talent show, I said, you caught me at exactly the right time, because I had really worked on that.
Oh, yeah.
And so I got off the stage that night, and Michael was sitting there with his assistant, pretty brunette. And he said, how much are your hands insured for?
Good question.
I just burst out laughing. I said, wait till I tell my girls. I have laughed at that so much because I went into music strictly to become a performer. I realized, like I say, Sunday, how much I had enjoyed
Right.
all of my years. It's lonesome in a way to do anything that much, but at the same time, it's so fulfilling. Now, if you were really listening, you would notice that Grace and Beauty just ends. A flat, just like that. But as I was mentioning competition, each pianist tried to outdo the other one. And so therefore they added little, what I call signature finishes. Now, I have to be honest and say I stole that one from Ragtime Bob Darsh. Not this one. I got the idea one day working around on a piece that came out in the 30s called Kitten on the Keys. And it had a great tag ending, so I sort of adopted that also. But it's a lot of fun to put something on the end, but almost all of Scott Joplin and Jimmy Scott's numbers just ended with a chord, which actually meant this is the end of the dance. The next piece is Solace. It was written by Scott Joplin.
Is it okay if I hear that one again?
1909.
May I hear that one again?
Oh,
Yeah,
the flashy one?
Yep.
Okay.
if you don't mind.
Okay.
Think of a better way to spend a half hour. I mean, wow. And I'm just blessed that, and many of us here at the station were saying how we remember when Bettie would play at the talent show, and that was really the first time that I encountered this wonderful person and musician. And you know, she was able to entertain us, and she performed for us up until the time when her fingers really kind of gave out. And so really, Godspeed, Bettie Jane. I mean, you really enriched all of our lives.